This seriously weird story comes from a Facebook page called Pedestrian. My first experience with a Ouija board was at a friend of a friend's house. I was there with my best friend and her boyfriend at the time. My best friend, we'll call her Jessa, had grown up in this house which was notoriously haunted. The women who lived there would wake up with scratches on their backs. They would routinely see the ghost of a little boy and crazy shit all the time. Anyway, Jessa's childhood friend moved in there when the family moved out. We were there for her housewarming party. Jessa's friend had a board. Jessa and I are both pretty spiritual and neither of us wanted to touch it. Nothing was happening, so Chuck convinced us to do it, saying we were witchy. As soon as we touched it, the cursor started moving. At first it was saying it was a little boy. Jessa and I looked at each other like, oh, frickin' hell, both of us knowing about a little boy in the house. Suddenly, Chuck was like, oh man, did you guys feel that? Yeah, we all felt it. The air became thick, like, hard to breathe. He described exactly what I felt. It was almost like the air was thick fog or mist, but it was still dry. The board started spelling things like SLUT, FUCKHER, CHEATER, BITCH, FUCKYOU. The cursor was moving more rapidly with every word. Finally, Jessa was like, okay, stop. And the pointer stopped, dead in its tracks. It stopped so abruptly that my hand slipped off. When I touched it again, it was slowly dragging itself to the bottom of the board, ending on goodbye. Months later, I was crashing at my friend's place, K and J. They had a basement apartment and I was crashing on their couch. The guys invited over some girls and I didn't know, and they wanted to use the Ouija board. Should I do that? I don't know the girls. Is this a good thing? I didn't want to touch it, but it wasn't working, so I finally gave in and decided to try it. I had to help them out. Now, as soon as I touched it, the pointer started moving. I was touching the pointer with my friend, Kay, and the cursor was moving really slowly. So as a game, I said, move faster, and it started moving faster. I kept saying, faster, and eventually it was moving so fast, my friend touching the cursor was saying, this isn't funny, as if I was moving it. I said I wasn't moving it, and he freaked out, releasing the board and the pointer, and the pointer went shooting across the room. At that moment, we were all pretty convinced it was real. One of the girls wanted to see more, so we grabbed the cursor and started again. So then the board asks to speak to a girl named Hayley. The board says, family father, and proceeds to spell her dad's name. She starts freaking out. The board says, I'm sorry about her father, and that her father was a drug addict and her mum's a drunk. It says she has to leave her house because her dad is angry. Hayley starts crying and freaking out, and the board says goodbye. We get back to the apartment and Hayley is crying. She tells us that her dad is a coke dealer and her mum is drunk all the time. Her home life is awful. Her dad would frequently get drunk and coked up and hit her. She was only 16 or 17 at the time. Kay and Jay say she can stay at their place too. Interestingly, months later, Hayley's mum dropped her off at the apartment complex, and she told Hayley that her great-grandfather helped build the place. She said he lived there his whole life and died there. After that night, I started reading about Ouija boards. A couple of nights later, I went to visit my best friend and her boyfriend at his place, which was walking distance from my apartment. I told them about the whole thing. He said he wanted to try it too. Reluctantly, Jessa and I agreed, keeping in mind we had all been drinking whiskey. Yes, I know, this is altogether an awful idea. The cursor starts spelling out trees, broken glass. Suddenly it starts getting violent, spelling out rape, F-U-C-K her teeth. Jessa and I tell it to stop and we say goodbye. The cursor drags to goodbye and we put the board away. Suddenly, Chuck is like, "Oh shit, dude, you're not walking home." He then explains his interpretation of what the board was saying. On my walk to my friend's place, like I said, they lived in a basement apartment, so instead of walking through the halls, we'd just go to the living room window and climb in. To get to the window, I would cut through a back clearing where there were tall trees all over. He's convinced that there are bad guys in there on that night, and if I walked home, I would get raped. Hence the F-U-C-K, her teeth. Needless to say, after that visual, I stayed over. The next morning when I walked through the clearing, there were broken glass bottles all over the place, and my friend said that they heard people drinking out there all night. Anyway, I moved out and Hayley and I became friends. Kay brought the board over as a housewarming gift. One day, my cousin came over to my apartment and her boyfriend at the time. Her boyfriend notices the board in the corner. He asks me about it and I laugh and tell him the whole story. His eyes get all wide and he asks if we can play with it. Being kind of stoned, I agreed and we started asking it questions. The pointer starts spelling Jess's name. We all get in the car and head over to her place. She's not home, but Chuck is. I left the board in the car and my cousin and her boyfriend and go to talk to Chuck. He said Jessa was at work until 9 that night, but we could come in and wait for her. After the incident, he was interested to see what was going to happen. When I got into the car, my cousin and her boyfriend said they heard fingers tapping as if someone or something was waiting impatiently for me to get back. We sat around waiting for a while and Chuck brings out his board from the last time I was over. We used it and it says Jessa, Jessa, and pointing to no, then to the sun in the corner of the board. Over and over, no sun, no sun. Eventually I figured out what it was saying, no light. I asked if it wanted me to shut off the light and it said no, we're not going to do that. I had read that bad spirits do not like the light. Finally, when Jessa got home, she said she was too tired and didn't want to try using it. We agreed to leave it alone and brought the board home. I didn't like having it in my home, so the next time I went to visit Hayley at Kay and Jay's place, I brought it back. She said we wanted to try it one more time and then we would get rid of it. I agreed. At this point, I was clearly addicted to it for some reason. So Hayley and I are at the basement apartment climbing out the window for cigarettes near the back clearing with the trees. We go back in and use a board. The board starts spelling out Hayley's name, and this time the spirit says its name is Maria. Hayley immediately starts to cry and says, "That's not funny." I had no idea why or what was going on, but the board keeps saying things like, "Tell them I miss them. Tell them I love them. I'm here. I love them." As Hayley's crying, she explains that her best friend's mum, Maria, had died a year ago. I remember the death. It was big news in our high school. Suddenly the cursor moved and spelled my name. I asked who it was and the cursor said Deb. I read that bad spirits cannot tell their names because they don't have one. If a spirit can tell you a name, then it's usually a good one. I ask how I know her and she says she's my spirit guide. Hayley says, "How do you know you're real?" And the cursor spells cigarette. And I said, "What do you mean?" And it says window. We look at each other and our heart sinks. I'm like, "She knows we smoke outside." And I said, "How will we know?" And she says, "Trees." I am like, "Fuck that." And Hayley says, "We have to do it." So we're smoking outside. I'm looking into the forest, sweating balls in fear, like I'm going to see a fucking demon face in the branches or something. Eventually we relax and then Hayley mid-sentence, her face drops and goes white and she's like, fuck, get inside now. I fucking toss my cigarette and jump in the window. We close the blinds and we're breathing super heavy. I'm like, "What the fuck happened?" She says, in the distance, there was a big ass, like 100-foot tall tree. There was no wind. I remember this because I was watching my cigarette smoke go directly up and I was blowing perfect O's without them disappearing. She says the tree was still, and then suddenly the whole tree, including the trunk, moved back and forth and then went perfectly still. I was like, hell no! And after a while of freaking out, sat back on that board. When we put our fingers on it, it said, "Did you see?" We fucking freaked out. It was spelling, "It's okay, I love you. It's okay, don't be scared." Finally, it asked to speak only to me and for Hayley to go away. Hayley jokingly said, "Oh, don't you like me?" And the board said, "Don't be sad." This story closes pretty weak because in my mind nothing really came of it. When I tried to use the board on my own, nothing happened. I couldn't move it without the help of Hayley, and my spirit guide couldn't communicate with me. I like to think it was real, and my spirit guide Deb was just trying to get me off the board. As I said, we had talked about it a lot, and we're using it quite a bit. I sometimes wonder what Deb wanted to tell me. Anyway, that's it. I haven't touched one to this day, but I do have a slight obsession with making Ouija boards as art.